Little Hen. Out in the middle of the country, on a big old farm, lived a wise little hen and her brood of chicks. They didn't have much money, but they lived in a comfortable hen house, and the wise little hen was a careful housekeeper. The little chicks enjoyed themselves out in the hot sunshine, pecking around in the farmyard. One day, the chicks all gathered round as the wise little hen came out of the hen house with a basket full of corn. "I must go and plant the corn, children," she said. "Otherwise we won't have anything to eat in the autumn. But there's too much work for me to do alone. Let's ask one of our neighbours to help." So they all went across the road to see their neighbour, Peter Pig. It was such a nice day. Peter was playing his accordion and dancing a merry jig in the front of his house. "Good morning, Peter," said the wise little hen. "I have this basket of corn to plant, and it's too much work for me to do on my own. I wonder if you could help me." Suddenly Peter grasped at his stomach and doubled up, making faces. "Oh dear," he wailed. "I'm afraid I can't today. I have such an awful stomachache. I think I might be sick." "Oh, I am sorry," said the wise little hen, and she went on her way with her chicks. As soon as they were out of sight, Peter Pig started to laugh, not looking the least bit sick. Meanwhile, the wise little hen went to see her other neighbour, Donald Duck's cousin, David, who lived on a barge on the river. David Duck was singing at the top of his voice and dancing a hornpipe on the deck. "Good morning, David," said the wise little hen. "Can you help me? I must plant the corn today, but there's too much work for me to do on my own." David Duck suddenly started to grimace. He clutched at his stomach and said, "Oh, no, I'm afraid I can't. I'm much too sick." "Oh, dear," said the wise little hen. "Then I'll just have to do it on my own." "Don't worry, Mother," chirped her chicks. "We'll help you." And they worked all day, hoeing and weeding the field, then watering each kernel of corn where the wise little hen had planted it. A few weeks later, the corn had grown ripe and tall. The wise little hen and her chicks danced with joy at the sight. "We must do some hard work now," said the wise little hen to her chicks, "and harvest all that corn. Let's see if Peter Pig and David Duck will help us." But neither of them were at home. However, it didn't take the wise little hen long to find them. She could hear them singing long before she found them, dancing at the roadside in the sunshine. They bowed and said, "Hello," very politely to the wise little hen and her family. "Good morning," said the wise little hen. "My corn is now ripe and ready to harvest. Will you help me?" "I'm afraid I'm still too ill to work," said Peter Pig, sticking out his tongue. The wise little hen was quite shocked to see that it was covered with bright yellow spots. Peter Pig wasn't taking any chances. He'd painted them on that morning before he'd set out, just in case. David Duck looked as miserable as possible. "And my stomach still hurts," he said. "What a shame," said the wise little hen, who wasn't taken in for a moment. "Then I'll have to do it by myself." "We'll help you," cheeped the chicks. And so they did. They worked all day, harvesting the corn, and then they carried it all back to the kitchen of the snug little hen house. Then the wise little hen set to work. She cooked and she baked until the table was covered with pots of tasty corn soup, plates of fluffy corn bread, jars of thick corn syrup, and piles of fresh ears of corn boiled and dripping with butter. Then she set off to see her neighbours, Peter Pig and David Duck. As soon as they saw her coming, they pretended to be ill. "Oh!" moaned Peter. "Ah!" groaned David. "I'm sorry to see that you're both still ill," said the wise little hen. "I was going to invite you to dinner to eat some of my corn." The pair brightened up very quickly, looking as perky and healthy as they really were. "Oh, it's nothing really," said Peter. "Yes, it passes very quickly," agreed David. "Well, I've got something that will be just right for you," said the wise little hen. The pair followed her eagerly back to the hen house. Their mouths began to water as they smelt the delicious aroma wafting from the kitchen. "Here you are," said the wise little hen to Peter Pig and David Duck as they stood outside. And she gave them a big bowl covered with a checked cloth. "Oh, what can it be?" gasped Peter Pig, and he whipped away the cloth. The two neighbours stared in horror at what was in the bowl. A large bottle of castor oil and 2 tablespoons. "Oh, I don't want any of that," exclaimed Peter Pig. "Me neither," said David Duck. They peered through the window of the hen house and saw the wonderful feast that the wise little hen was serving up to her chicks. David Duck looked at Peter Pig. "What fools we are," they said sadly. "We won't pretend to be sick when we're well. Not ever again." And they took it in turns to kick each other all the way home.
Piglet's Honey Expedition. Piglet woke one morning with a very funny feeling. It wasn't a hungry kind of feeling like Pooh had all the time, and it wasn't the scary kind of feeling you got when you thought a heffalump might be nearby. It wasn't even the kind of feeling that went away as Piglet dressed himself, or as he ate his breakfast of haycorns. "I think I'll go and ask my friend Pooh," said Piglet. "He'll know what it is." But when he went outside and saw all the trees and plants blooming and budding, and felt the sunshine, he knew what the funny feeling was. It was spring. "And if it's spring," he said to himself, "that means it must be Pooh's birthday." Piglet felt pleased that he'd remembered an occasion of such importance, and then he felt anxious, as he wondered what he could give Pooh as a present. "I know," he said, and he scurried into his house and rummaged through his kitchen for a jar. "I'll put some honey in to give to Pooh," he said, as he searched his big cupboard. But all he could find was a jar full of haycorns, and on the side of the jar Owl had written the word "Haycon," because that was what was stored inside. Piglet emptied the haycorns out of it, washed off "Haycon" from the side, and put a spoon in his pocket. Then, tying his muffler round his head and ears instead of round his neck, and wrapping himself up in netting to keep the bees away, he went in search of honey. Not being particularly fond of honey himself, Piglet wasn't very experienced at finding it, but still he felt quite positive as he set out into the 100-acre wood. And not really knowing where to begin, he walked along looking upwards, keeping an eye open for bees, and he didn't notice the tree in front of him until he hit it. "Ow!" he shouted, and found himself sitting at the foot of the tree, rubbing his nose. He straightened his muffler, which had fallen over one eye in the collision. Piglet felt overcome with the difficulty of his task, but cheered himself up by eating a haycorn that was lying on the ground just by his foot. He said when he'd finished it, and looked up to see if there were any more, because, by luck, he was sitting under a haycorn tree. And as he looked up, he happened to see, just there, a whole swarm of bees buzzing around a hole in the tree trunk. Piglet squealed with excitement, and jumping up, he pulled the netting tight around his face. "So they don't recognize me," he said in an offhand sort of way, as though he wasn't at all frightened of being stung, even though he was. Carrying the jar under one arm, he began climbing the tree, slowly, little by little, because piglets aren't really very good at climbing trees, even when they're being exceptionally brave in a good cause. "Don't look down," he told himself, as he clung to the trunk of the fat old tree. But then he did, and he knew why he'd said it, because he saw the forest spread beneath him, all light and bright and green, and looking very far away. "Oh, help!" Piglet shouted and held on very tightly to the nearest branch. But then he remembered he had to have a present to give Pooh, and so, taking a deep breath, he climbed up to the bees. Pulling out the spoon he had brought with him, Piglet reached into the hollow in the tree and filled the spoon with honey. "In it goes," he said, quite cheerful again, although just a little put off by the loud buzz all round him. "And another," he said, as he reached out again. But after he'd done it 3 or 4 times, the buzz was so loud that he didn't feel at all brave any more. So, still clutching the jar, he climbed back down the tree, much faster than he'd climbed up. "There," he said to himself proudly as he reached the bottom. "Nothing to it, really." But when he looked inside the jar, there was only a very little honey. "I wonder if Pooh will even notice this much," Piglet said sadly. But then he forgot to worry about that, because there was a swarm of angry bees around his head going bzzz, bzzz, bzzz. "Go away," Piglet said, trying to hide the wobble in his voice, and he stood up and ran off with his jar as fast as he could go. But then the netting, which he'd wrapped round himself, suddenly worked itself loose and tripped him up, and he fell over with a loud crash. When Piglet opened his eyes again, he was alone. The bees had gone, and all he could hear was the chirp-chirp of the birds. The jar lay broken beside him, but the bottom bit with the honey in it was still all in one piece. Piglet picked it up rather sadly. "Oh, dear me, what will Pooh think of this? Everyone's bound to have given him such nice things he won't even notice this." And so, feeling even sadder, Piglet went over to his friend's house. Pooh was sitting outside, pretending not to be waiting for his birthday visitors. "Happy birthday, Pooh," said Piglet rather solemnly, at which Pooh looked up and very quickly said, "Oh, to help!" and ran as fast as his stout legs would carry him into the safety of his house, where he shut the door firmly and growled from behind it, "Go away, whoever you are." Piglet, feeling surprised and dismayed, wondered if there was a heffalump or woozle just behind him that he couldn't see and Pooh could. "Pooh," he said in a small voice, "It's me, Piglet." He waited, and after a long while he suddenly saw Pooh's furry nose poke round the door, only he had been waiting so long and so expectantly that the sight made him jump with fright. "Piglet," came Pooh's voice from behind the door. "Is it you?" Yes, of course. I think so," stammered Piglet, bewildered. "Ah, silly me," said Pooh, emerging at last. He took a closer look at Piglet and then said, "Still, you don't really look like you. I thought you were a very small monster, a very fierce small monster, or else I wouldn't have hidden," he added hastily. "What are you doing in that disguise?" Piglet looked down at himself. "Oh," he said casually, "it was just something I had to do this morning." And he handed Pooh the broken jar. "Oh, a present. And thank you," said Pooh. And he took the jar, or what was left of it, looked at it from all sides and said, "I know, it's a jar for keeping things in, like the one I gave Eeyore on his birthday." And Piglet said, rather sadly, "Something like that." But then Pooh saw the honey inside, put his paw in and said, and was rather quiet for a while. As he cleaned the last of the honey from his fur, Pooh thanked his friend very much indeed. But Piglet wasn't listening. He was so pleased that Pooh was pleased that all he could do was hop from one foot to another and look at the ground and feel glad that he wouldn't have to be so very brave again for a long, long time.
Dumbo plays cricket. One fine day, Dumbo the elephant stopped to watch some boys getting ready to play cricket in the park. They were arguing because one side had more people in it than the other. "One of you will just have to watch," said the captain, "or else we will have to find another player to make the sides even." "I'll play," offered Dumbo. "I love cricket." "Don't be silly," said the boy scornfully. "Elephants can't play cricket." Dumbo was rather hurt, but he stayed to watch all the same. After a while, one of the boys hit the ball so hard that it landed on the roof of a house on the other side of the park fence. "Now look what you've done," grumbled the others. "How are we going to get our ball back now?" "Knock at the door and ask," the boy said cheerfully. So they went round to the house and knocked at the door. An old lady came out and looked up at the ball stuck between the chimney pots. "I'm sorry, my dears," she said, "but I can't possibly get it down for you. It's much too high up for me to reach." The boys were crestfallen. "That's the end of our game, then," they said. They turned to leave, but Dumbo, who had followed them, suddenly said, "I can get your ball back for you." "You can?" The boys were amazed. "But elephants can't climb walls." "They can fly, though," said Dumbo, smiling. "At least, I can." And he spread his enormous ears and soared up into the air. Up over the roof he flew, neatly picking up the ball in his trunk as he zoomed past the chimney pots. Expertly, he tossed the ball to the captain, then flew back over the park fence and landed beside the cricket pitch. The boys came running to meet him. "That was great," they shouted. "Elephants can play cricket. At least you can." "Thank you," smiled Dumbo. He joined in the match and thoroughly enjoyed the rest of his afternoon.
Mickey Mouse Goes Camping. Morty and Ferdy Mouse were very excited. They were going on a camping holiday with their Uncle Mickey. Minnie Mouse waved them off. "How long are you going for? A year?" she giggled, looking at the overloaded car. It was piled high with a tent, sleeping bags, pots and pans, lots of tinned food, and 2 spades. "What do we need the spades for, Uncle Mickey?" asked Ferdy. Mickey wouldn't say. "Wait and see," he said mysteriously. Right out in the country, they found an ideal camping spot. As soon as the car stopped, the boys leapt out with their fishing nets and headed for the nearby stream. "Come back!" yelled Mickey. "You've got work to do first." And the boys had to help him put up the tent, hammering in tent pegs and tightening guy ropes. It seemed to take hours. "Can we go fishing now?" the boys asked. "No," said Mickey, handing out the spades. "You haven't finished yet. We've got to dig a ditch round the tent, so if it rains the water will collect there, not in our tent." The boys were dismayed. "I don't call digging ditches much of a holiday," grumbled Ferdy. "Neither do I," sulked Morty. But Mickey stood over them until the ditch was too wide even to step over and as deep as they were tall. They had to scramble in and out of it to get inside the tent. But at last the boys were free to go fishing in the stream. Mickey followed with his fishing rod. "I'll catch our supper," he boasted. But they would all have starved if they'd had to rely on Mickey. All he caught was an old boot. So they opened a few of the tins, mixed everything together in the frying pan, and had a wonderful supper. Before long the boys began to yawn, tired out from all the fresh air. "Time for bed," said Mickey, and soon the boys were tucked up in their sleeping bags. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and soon they heard the pitter-patter of rain outside. Mickey smiled contentedly. It could rain as much as it liked. They would all be snug and dry. "I'll bet you're glad we dug that ditch," he said proudly. "Now we won't get wet at all." They all slept soundly through the night. "Up you get, lazy bones!" shouted Mickey bright and early the next morning. He threw back the tent flaps and rushed outside. "Splash! Help! Help!" spluttered Mickey. Morty and Ferdy peeped out to find Uncle Mickey floundering around in the ditch, only now it looked more like a moat. "I thought you said the ditch would keep us dry," giggled Morty, and the twins doubled up with laughter. To make matters worse, the ditch was too wide for the boys to cross, so Mickey had to stay up to his neck in the water while they used his head as a stepping stone. "Oh, next time we go on holiday, we'll take a caravan," groaned Mickey, shivering as he dried himself in the sun. "Oh, no," said the twins. "We love camping." And waving gaily, they set off to catch some fish.
Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, Part 4. Snow White was trying to comfort the old peddler woman who had called at the cottage. She had seemed so ill, and the gentle princess had brought her inside to rest. But when the old woman drank the glass of water from Snow White, she seemed to recover surprisingly quickly. "Now, I'm going to let you into a special secret because you've been so kind to poor old Granny," she said, leaning forward and wiping the shiny red apple in her hands. "This is no ordinary apple," she whispered. "It's a magic wishing apple." Oh! Snow White's eyes opened wide with wonder. "A wishing apple?" "Yes, my dear," the old woman went on. "One bite and all your dreams will come true." "Oh, how wonderful!" Snow White exclaimed. "Will my dreams really come true?" "Yes, girlie," said the old witch kindly, trying to hide the evil glint of triumph in her eyes. "Now, all you have to do is make a wish and take a bite." "Perhaps there's someone you love?" coaxed the old woman cunningly, desperate now in case her plan should fail at the last moment. "Well, as a matter of fact, there is someone," she said shyly. "Ha, ha! I thought so," laughed the old woman. "A pretty girl like you is bound to be in love with somebody. You see, old Granny knows a young girl's heart." A dreamy look came into Snow White's eyes, and for a while she was lost in her thoughts. She pictured the handsome prince in her mind, remembering how they had met by the wishing well outside the castle. It seemed so long ago, but now she longed to see her wonderful prince again. "Now take the apple, dearie, and make your wish." The old woman's voice cut into her thoughts. The old crone seemed very pleased when at last Snow White took the apple. "I wish," began Snow White. "That's it, go on," said the old woman impatiently. "I wish," continued Snow White, gazing at the apple she held in her hand, "that my prince will carry me away to his castle, where we will live happily ever after." "Fine, fine," encouraged the old woman. "Hurry up now. Don't let the wish grow cold. Take a bite." She watched eagerly as Snow White bit into the apple, and at once her arm went limp, and the apple slipped from her hand. "Oh," Snow White said weakly, "I feel so strange." Her legs buckled under her, and slowly she fell to the floor. The wicked queen rubbed her hands together with delight as she looked down at the little princess lying lifelessly on the floor. "Her breath will still," she crowed. "Her blood will congeal, and now I am the fairest in the land." Satisfied at last, the queen left the cottage to travel back to her castle and reverse the spell which had changed her into an ugly old woman. Outside, the sky was overcast, and large raindrops began to fall. A storm was brewing up, with flashes of lightning and an approaching roll of thunder. The old woman stopped in fright as she heard the sound of shouting voices and stampeding hoofs. Then she saw the dwarfs and animals charging into the clearing. "There she goes!" shouted Grumpy from his perch on the deer's back. "After her, everyone!" The old woman turned and fled through the woods, the dwarfs chasing after her. She ran like the wind on her spindly legs, her cloak flying out behind her until she reached some high rocky slopes. Hoping that the dwarfs wouldn't dare follow her up the slippery crags in the driving rain, she began to climb. But, refusing to be put off by anything, the angry dwarfs clambered up after her.
Clawing frantically at the rocks, she scaled up higher and higher, with the dwarfs pursuing her relentlessly, despite the lashing rain and terrifying flashes of lightning. The old witch heaved herself up onto the top of a ledge to the highest pinnacle of the rocks. Panting for breath, she looked down at the dwarfs, who were struggling up towards her, and she suddenly realized the mistake she had made. She couldn't go any higher, and she couldn't climb down. "Oh!" she muttered furiously to herself. "I'm trapped! What can I do?" She looked desperately around her for a way of escape. Then she noticed a huge loose boulder on the ledge. "If only I could push it over on top of the dwarfs," she thought to herself. She seized a thick branch and used it to pry the boulder towards the end of the ledge. "I'll get you! I'll get you!" she screeched at the dwarfs. "I'll crush your bones!" The dwarfs were nearing the summit now, and Grumpy was the first to catch sight of the old woman, heaving the boulder with incredible strength. "Look out! Look out!" he shouted to warn the others. And in the next moment, the dwarfs pressed themselves flat against the rock as the enormous boulder slowly rolled off the ledge and gathered speed as it hurtled towards them. Hardly daring to breathe, the dwarfs closed their eyes in terror and waited. The boulder whizzed over their heads and crashed down the rocky slope, bouncing harmlessly as it came to rest on the ground below. The dwarfs didn't even have time to sigh with relief before they heard a terrible scream. A bolt of lightning had struck the ledge above, shattering it to pieces. The old woman toppled and fell down, down, down to the very bottom of the dark crags. The stunned dwarfs peered below them and saw the limp figure lying below. The wicked queen was dead. The dwarfs had no time to waste in pity. They climbed down and hurried to the little house in the forest clearing, praying that Snow White was safe. But that evening the woodlands were shrouded in mist, and grief lingered in the air all around the cottage. Inside, candles were burning, and Snow White was laid out in the centre of the room. The dwarfs kept watch over her all through the night, with the forlorn woodland animals looking in through the window at the sad scene. The dwarfs' eyes were filled with tears. Grumpy, unable to bear it any longer, broke down and sobbed loudly, while Dopey rested his face on Doc's shoulder and wept too. Snow White was so beautiful that the dwarfs couldn't bring themselves to bury her. They wanted to keep her where they would always be able to see her and be by her side. So, the next morning, they set to work and made a coffin of pure gold with a lid of crystal glass. They carried it out to the back of the house and laid it beneath the trees, which were in full bloom. Snow White looked more beautiful than ever in the glass coffin, and the dwarfs felt even sadder as they laid bunches of flowers all around her and knelt to pray. When they rose to their feet, their grief-stricken silence was broken by the sound of a horse galloping through the woods, and the voice of someone singing. They trooped round to the front of the cottage and stood on the doorstep to listen. It was a man's voice, and now they saw a handsome stranger riding towards the little house on a beautiful white horse. "I do believe it's a prince," Doc said in awe, while the other dwarfs could only stand and stare in wonder. "Good morning," said the prince, dismounting from his horse. "I'm sorry to trespass on your land, but I have ridden a long way, and I think you might be able to help me. I have been searching for someone for a long time. She is a beautiful princess, and I heard that perhaps I could find her at the house of the 7 dwarfs. Her name is Snow White. Does she live here?" The dwarfs looked at one another, and then stared down at the ground, not knowing how to tell the prince the sad news. "Does Snow White live here?" repeated the prince, anxious for an answer to his question. "Well, Snow White is dead," Doc blurted out as a large tear rolled down his cheek. "The wicked queen poisoned her with an apple, and she's dead." "Where does Snow White lie?" the prince asked urgently. "Beneath the trees," answered Doc, pointing to the back of the cottage. "Please let me see her," said the prince. The dwarfs led the way, with the prince and all the woodland animals following behind. They stood around the coffin, looking sadly down at Snow White. "Please unfasten the coffin," the prince asked quietly. The dwarfs did as he told them, and the prince knelt down to look at his beloved princess. Slowly he bent to kiss her lips. A hush fell on the sorrowful group, but the prince was smiling very faintly as he watched Snow White. A tiny movement flickered across her face, and she stirred as though beginning to awaken from a very deep sleep. The dwarfs and animals stared in amazement, hardly able to believe their eyes as they saw Snow White stretching her arms. She gazed drowsily around, her eyes lighting up when she saw first the dwarfs and then the prince. "My prince," she smiled, "you found me at last." "At last," echoed the prince, and kissed her again. The dwarfs were so happy they jumped for joy and began a wild dance of celebration, throwing their hats right up into the sky. Doc and Grumpy hugged each other with happiness, and the woodland animals pranced and leapt into the air. Then the prince lifted Snow White onto his white horse, and the dwarfs realized, rather sadly, that she would be leaving them now. They gathered around and gazed at their very own princess. "We'll miss you, Snow White," Doc said. "And I'll miss all of you too," said Snow White, her eyes clouding. "But I'll never forget you, and one day we will come back and see you again." The prince lifted Bashful up so that Snow White could kiss him goodbye. She kissed each of her 7 little friends in turn, and as usual, Dopey wasn't contented with one kiss and wanted another one. "Oh, Dopey," Snow White laughed affectionately. The prince began to lead the horse forward, and Snow White and the dwarfs called out their goodbyes to each other. The dwarfs stood and watched Snow White and her prince as they disappeared over the horizon. They were sad to lose the lovely princess, but in their hearts they knew that all was well, for Snow White's dearest wish had at last come true, and she would live with her prince happily ever after.
There was a crooked man. There was a crooked man, and he walked a crooked mile. He found a crooked sixpence beside a crooked stile. He bought a crooked cat, which caught a crooked mouse, and they all lived together in a crooked little house.